Hello everyone, it's the weekend. The project today is try to get this gas gauge working. It doesn't move at all, which I've never seen before. Usually it'll move a little bit even if it's disconnected. Usually if it's completely disconnected it goes to full. If it's shorted it goes to empty, but this thing's not doing anything. I think one of the problems might be the sending unit. The gas tank on these is behind the seat right here. Pretty easy to get at, but you got to put the seat forward. I probably spent half an hour looking for some kind of lever to flip the back of the seat forward. On these old Fords there is no lever. Very surprising to me. What there is on each side there's a bolt. This bolt has a star head, which for 1972 is, I didn't know anybody was using star heads, but an Allen wrench will work. And it basically bolts the back of the seat to the bottom of the seat. And unless that's resolved, unless that's removed, it won't flip forward. So let me show you where it's at. So now we flip forward pretty nicely. And right here is the bracket that bolt goes through, and you can see the hole where the bolt is going through. So take both those out. They weren't tight. I don't know how you do that in a dark night when you have a flat tire or something, but that's how you get the seat out. And you flip it forward, and here's the gas tank. Not much room for storage behind the seat, which is probably why you have to actually unbolt it to flip it forward. But I did notice that the jack handle's back here, and the provisions to hold it down are back here. So should you get a flat tire, you do need to get this seat forward. Anyway, there is the sending unit right there. It's got a series of bolts around the edge that I will take out. I'm going to vacuum this out so dirt doesn't get in the tank. And then we'll have really good view of not only the sending unit condition, but the inside of the tank. I'm not expecting the inside of the tank to be too bad, but this will tell me for sure what it looks like. So I've got the area cleaned up. I had to take this pipe out here. This is an overflow pipe. When you fill the tank, if you overfill it, just make sure it drains back into the tank rather than get all over the ground. It was easy, just a couple of hose clamps. But you can see the top right now of the sending unit and the 5 bolts that hold it down. This is what goes to the gauge, this orange wire. This wire here is a ground. It connects right to there, to that tab. This gauge has to be grounded. And if you're thinking, well, why isn't it grounded? Because this is bolted down. This has a rubber gasket around it to keep fumes from leaking out. So it actually needs a separate ground. So the first thing I'm going to check is whether this wire itself is grounded. Pretty easy to do with an ohm meter. If you're not familiar with an ohm meter, it's just a multimeter you get anywhere. Sometimes Harbor Freight gives these things away. This particular one I bought in Europe when I was over there, but I've had it for years. Very simple. You put it on ohms, which is this symbol here. Any one of these will work. Doesn't really matter for a test like this. I just choose the one in the middle. And if you touch the 2 leads together, if I can get them together on film, you'll see the gauge go basically to 0. It's 0.01. Now it's at 0, which means no resistance. So a clear connection. You take them apart, you go to number 1, which means infinite resistance, no connection. So let's see what happens when I go, doesn't matter which way you connect these, there's no real plus or minus on an ohm meter for resistance. Okay, so I'm just going to try from the connector itself. It's a little tricky to do. on the phone. Very tricky to do on the phone. See if I can figure this out. Pardon the fingers in the way. Okay, I'm on the connector. I'm just going to touch it to the fuel line, which is typically grounded, and look at that. We're getting a reading. Come on now. We were getting a reading. Yeah. So it looks like 1.42, and basically we've got a good ground with this wire. If I was able to hold it there longer, if I wasn't holding the phone, it would have gone to near 0, which is what we want. So this grounding wire is good. Next up, I'm going to take these bolts out and take a look at the sender. I expect to find some issues with the sender. Probably rust, probably the sock on the sender has been destroyed, but we'll find out shortly. Okay, check this out. That's what I expected. I have it out, 1/4-inch bolts, 5 of them, pull them out, no problem. Gasket's in good shape below it, which is nice. Make sure the battery's disconnected, by the way. This is gas fumes you're dealing with. You don't want any sparks in here. But check this out. So here's the top. Here's the mechanism. Completely frozen. It won't even move. Completely frozen. But check this out. This loop is supposed to hold what's called a float. And the float does exactly what it's named. It floats in the tank with the level of the gas and moves this lever between here and here, which sends a signal to the gas gauge of how much gas you've got in the tank. Problem is, there's no float on here. It's usually plastic or brass, and it has to float. Well, it's not even on here. Sometimes they get a crack and fill up with gas, which makes you read empty all the time. But this one, there's nothing on it, and I'm willing to bet there's been no float in here for a long time, which is why this is rusted solid, because the gauge was always in the same position. This thing's probably going to have to be replaced. I'll try to free it up and see if I can get it to work. I doubt it, but I have to find the float. It's probably in the tank somewhere. I'm going to try to view it with this light, but I don't think that's going to come out on the phone. And it's not doing a very good job on the phone, but what I do see is the tank's in decent shape. I don't see any significant rust in here. In fact, I really don't see rust, which is amazing and cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a magnet in here and see if it pulls up any rust particles. Hopefully it doesn't. And if it doesn't, it means the tank's in real good shape. I just have to replace the sender, which I knew I'd have to anyway. There's just no way on a vehicle that sat this long with gas in it that sender would be any good. So that's the next step is the magnet. And I'll do a little work with the sender, but honestly, I'm not going to spend a lot of time with it. It looks like it's shot with no float. It's useless to me. I don't think I'll be able to pull the float out of here. Anyway, so there's not much really I can do. I will try to inspect what's called the sock. What the sock is, it's a filter in the tank that keeps debris from being pulled up from the tank. On this old Ford, it looks like the sock is at the end of this pipe. Usually it's on the sender, but I guess on Fords it's not. So I'll see if I can get in there with a better light and try it out. So I've got the magnet in the tank. I'm going to fish it around a bit. Let's see what I find. It's a pretty strong magnet. If there's rust in here, it will pull it out. Not much. Not much at all. Just a real tiny bit. That's great news. Great news. So this tank is clearly in good shape. I'm going to do this a little bit more, make sure I don't find anything, but this tank looks like it's good to go. So I'll spend a little work with the sender. If I can get it working, I'll make a float but I don't think I'll get it working, but we'll see. So I've got the sender apart. Just bend these 3 tabs, make them flat, and the whole assembly comes apart. You'll see inside here, see that ribbed piece of steel? What happens is the fuel gauge has a piece of brass that goes up and down and touches that. That has to be clean, and it actually looks remarkably clean. The inside of this looks remarkably clean. I'm super surprised about that. And this is the arm. Remember, this is where the float would be. This is the outside. This is the inside. So see that piece of brass that's all green? That's not supposed to be green. What happens, how the fuel gauge works is, as your fuel level goes up and down, the lever moves, which changes the location of that piece of brass, which is called the wiper. And that wiper, since it connects to that ribbed piece of steel inside the tank, has varying resistance on that ribbed steel, and it sends a message back to the gas gauge through this connection to tell it what to read. This wiper has to be clean, and it's not, but it can be cleaned up. I can't believe I'm about to say this, but this might be salvageable. It's certainly clean enough to be salvageable. So I'm going to try that. I still need to come up with a float. But what I can do is clean it up, hook it up, and see if the gauge moves when I move this long lever. If it does, then it still works. If it doesn't, then I have to buy a new sender. So what I used to clean this was mass airflow sensor cleaner. I did not use carb cleaner. Maybe you can. I just didn't want something that tough eating up the wiper and this rubber inside this thing and such. So I'm holding it all together now, and I'm going to hook my ohm meter to it, move this, and see if it changes. All right, let's give this a try. So I've got one lead hooked up to the output to the gas gauge. I'm going to connect another lead to ground, and then I'm going to move this needle here. This ought to be a real challenge while holding the phone, but let's see how it works. So we're connected to ground. You can immediately see that the voltmeter does change. Hold on one sec, let me get it better situated. So watch the meter as I move the float lever. You see some change, but not a lot. Just come over. So we've got, it's all cleaned up as best I can clean it anyway. We've got ground attached, we've got the output to the fuel gauge attached, and we're going to move the lever. You can see there is some difference here, but it ought to be consistent, and it's not. The angle of the lever matters, and it's just not consistent, and it's frankly, it's weird values. It's very weird values, so cleaning it has not helped. You know, we've got 141, and I can feel the wiper is connecting well. I can feel it. 128, 168. you know, if I put this in, I'll probably get some reading out of it, but it won't be consistent. It'll bounce all over the place and it really won't be usable. But I'm going to try to hook it up to the gas gauge anyway and see what happens. All right, battery's hooked up now, and key is on. Need the key on. You don't need the engine running to test the gas gauge. So there's the gauge. It's hooked up and to ground and to the sending plug. Let's see if we get anything here. No, we're not getting anything. It's not moving at all. And not one bit. Surprising me, it's not moving at all. But it's not. Yeah, that really surprises me. I would expect it to move a little bit. Let's make sure I've got power. The battery's hooked up right. Yeah, the dash lights are working, so the battery's hooked up right. So the sender is clearly bad, and maybe the gauge too, but next step is to change the sender. You know what I could also try, and I think I'll try that. I'm going to short the sender out and see if the gauge goes to, I think it's empty on a Ford. I think it's empty, but it'll be empty or full. So I'll try that next. Okay, so the wire that goes to the tank, I've shorted out, so we should see when I turn the key on some movement. Oh yeah, look at that. Look at that. So the gauge works. The gauge works. Okay, I don't want to keep it like that, but awesome. Okay, that's good news. So I'm going to need to buy a sender, put that in, and hopefully the gauge will start to work. Yeah, it's dropping right back down to where it should. So it's a few nights later. I have the new sending unit. It's cool that it's stainless. It's got a brass float, which is great. The problem is on the ohm meter, it doesn't appear to be working. I'm not sure why. I'm going to put it in anyway. It doesn't take any time to do, to see maybe if it's my meter is not sensitive enough or whatever, but I doubt it. So stand by. As you know, it goes right in here. Just pull the old one back out and throw it in. All right, moment of truth here. It's in. You can see that the power line is hooked up, the ground is hooked up. It's bolted down. So, like I was saying before, the ohm meter really didn't register anything when I hooked it up, and I'm not sure that's a good sign. So I guess the only thing to do now is just watch the gauge. I'm going to turn the key on, and that should fire the gauge. See if it starts moving. Oh, it's moving. It's moving. Let's see where it goes. Hopefully it won't go too far. Oh, awesome. It looks like it's working. It's got just over a quarter, which makes sense because I dumped a few gallons in it. You know, shaking the truck might make it move a little bit, but I'm going to put some more gas in it, but it looks to me like this thing is working. Very, very good news. So next step, put some more gas in and see what happens. So I put a few gallons in. Sure enough, we got half a tank. It's working beautiful now. Just perfect. I put about 3 gallons in. It was just over a quarter. So it's pretty close. So that's another job out of the way. I'm almost done. This thing is almost ready to put up for sale. Couple of little cleanup things I want to do, and then I'll list it. More later.